Meanwhile, Christianity gave us the separation of church and state. Again, that's not controversial. Historians will tell you that.
Tell me, where is democracy in the Bible? Where is it?
Well, you can just read Joshua Berman's book, Created Equal. It's throughout Deuteronomy, for example. He points out that Deuteronomy envisions an egalitarian society. It's not modern democracy, but there is those elements there where the people are called to, for example, decide if they want a king, to call up to do certain aspects in terms of like electing a court of people, like judges, for example.
What I'm saying, our debate tonight is about humanism and human values, and of course, you won't find what we would call normal representative democracy in the Bible anywhere.
The separation of church and state, as I noted, comes out of the Christian tradition. It comes from Jesus saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God.
This is part 4 of my final response to Mike Jones and his debate with Dan Barker. You can find parts 1 through 3 in the description below. In this episode, I'm responding to 3 big claims Mike makes. First, that the Bible teaches a primitive form of democracy. Second, that separation of church and state grew out of Christianity. Third, that promoting Christianity today can reduce support for authoritarianism and Christian nationalism. If you have watched the earlier parts, you know I care a lot about using social science correctly. In this video, I will show again how Mike misreads the research and then claims support that the papers do not actually give him. I will also explain why the Bible does not teach democracy and why democracy was not seen as a Christian ideal until roughly the last 200 years. For most of church history, many major Christian leaders opposed it. Stick around to the end because I will explain why I think secular humanism does more good for society than Christianity does. Hello my friends, this is Shen from Mindful Living. Welcome to the channel. Here we practice being mindful of how we think, so we are less likely to be misled or manipulated, especially on religious topics. If that is something you are into, please subscribe. It really helps the channel and keeps me going. Before we talk about whether Christianity influenced democracy, we need to get clear on the basic question: what do we even mean by democracy? The word is not Christian at all. It is Greek. Demokratia comes from demos, meaning the common people, and kratos, meaning power or rule. In classical Athens, centuries before Christianity, demokratia literally meant people power. Male citizens gathered, debated, and voted directly on laws. Greek writers also used the word isonomia. It comes from isos and nomos, meaning equality and law. Isonomia was the idea that citizens should be equal in their legal and political rights. Herodotus praised it as a popular alternative to monarchy and oligarchy. So long before Jesus appears in the 1st century CE, we already have a clear pre-Christian set of concepts: Greek democracy and Greek equality under the law. Of course, modern democracy looks very different from ancient Athens or other early societies that had democracy-like systems. Modern states are huge. They have constitutions, political parties, courts, and formal protection for individual rights. Athens was a single city. Only a limited group of male citizens could participate. Decisions were made face-to-face. Offices were often filled by lottery, and all of this existed inside a slave society. So yes, the details are different, but the core idea is already there. Political power should belong, in some real sense, to the people being governed. The whole point of demokratia and isonomia was that rule-making should not be the privilege of a king or a small group of elites. It should be shared among citizens. So when someone talks as if democracy only appears in the modern era, or as if Christianity is the main reason democracy exists, they are skipping over a long and messy history. They are also skipping over a very old human argument about who gets to rule. That argument begins long before the Church, Greeks, Romans, and many other cultures wrestled with how to limit rulers and give ordinary people a stake in government. The instinct to put power in the hands of the governed is ancient. It is not the product of any one religion. The American democratic experiment drew from more than one tradition. Yes, some founders framed their ideas in Christian terms, but they also leaned heavily on Enlightenment philosophy, and they were paying attention to indigenous political systems too, including a sophisticated confederacy of the 6 nations. This is not some fringe point. In a resolution you read in the U.S. Senate on September 16, 1987, Congress explicitly recognized the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy as a major influence. The resolution says that key framers, most notably George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, greatly admired 6 nations concept and governmental practices. It goes on to say that the union of the original 13 colonies into one republic was explicitly modeled upon the Iroquois Confederacy, and that many democratic principles in the Constitution reflect that influence. So even at the level of public national memory, the US story is not democracy came out of Christianity. It is a layered, hybrid product. Christianity is one string among several, not the source that explains everything. I will leave a link to the video introducing the Iroquois Confederacy in the description below. With that in mind, let's examine Mike Jones's claims in the debate.
Furthermore, a proliferation of religious devotion, faith in God, and reliance on the Bible has historically been a determining factor in establishing schools for children, creating universities, building hospitals for the sick, and homes for the homeless, taking care of orphans and the elderly, resisting oppression, establishing law and order, and developing democracy.
Christianity was a determining factor in developing democracy. Really? Then what are we supposed to do with Athens? Was its polity inspired by Christianity centuries before Jesus? What about the Iroquois Confederacy? Was it grounded in biblical teaching? Clearly, societies can develop democracy-like systems without any knowledge of Christianity. So Mike is not describing history carefully here. He is inflating one strand of influence onto the determining strand. Yes, Christians eventually adopted democracy and learned to read the Bible through that lens, but that is not the same thing as saying the Bible teaches democracy. It doesn't. In the Old Testament era, Israel did not practice rule by the people. The Davidic kingdom, often praised as Israel's ideal model, was a monarchy. Even before that, Israel's tribal period was not democracy. It was a religious and kingship confederation led by judges and priests, not citizens voting on laws. In the New Testament period, many Jews were hoping for a Messiah who would drive out Rome and restore Israel. But what they expected was not democratic self-government. It was a nation ruled under God's law by God's chosen king. In modern terms, that looks far closer to theocracy than to democracy. Neither Jesus nor Paul lays out a political system. Their attention is on proclaiming the gospel and waiting for the kingdom of God. And it is a real stretch to call that kingdom a democracy in any meaningful sense. In a moment, I am going to critique the Bible passages Mike uses to support democracy. The way he gets there pushes inferences past the breaking point. But before we go there, let's step back and look at how major church leaders through history actually evaluated democracy. Historically, democracy was not something church leaders championed. For most of Christian history, Christian majority nations were monarchies. The standard political assumption was not rule by the people, but rule by kings who claimed divine authority rather than consent of the governed. Take Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century. In his praise of Constantine, Eusebius treats monarchy as the natural political partner of monotheism. He presents the ideal Christian empire as unified under one God in heaven and one emperor on earth, and he praises monarchy while criticizing rule by many, including democracy. In other words, early Christian political theology did not see people power as a biblical ideal. It saw a godly emperor as the earthly mirror of the heavenly king. Move forward to the Middle Ages, and you get the same pattern. In the Regno, Thomas Aquinas argues that kingship is the best constitution because a single ruler preserves unity and imitates God's rule. He even uses nature as an analogy, saying, "Among bees there is one king bee. and concludes from this that it is best for a human multitude to be ruled by one person. So again, a major Christian thinker is not laying groundwork for democracy. He is giving a philosophical argument for monarchy. Even into the modern period, the official Catholic stance was openly hostile to liberal democracy. In 1864, Pope Pius IX issued Quanta Cura along with syllabus of errors. Among the errors condemned was the idea that the people's will or public opinion constitutes a supreme law independent of divine authority. The syllabus also rejects liberty of conscience and treats free speech and the free press as dangerous modern innovations. That is basically a formal rejection of popular sovereignty and the liberal democratic project. So when Mike talks as if Christianity naturally produced democracy, he is telling a story church history simply does not support. For most of the tradition, influential Christian leaders defended monarchy, distrusted the rule by the many, and resisted the very ideals that define modern democracy. Now let's look at John Calvin. Calvin was not fond of monarchy. In Institutes 428, he says aristocracy is preferable, and he treats democracy or popular rule as the form of government with the strongest tendency to sedition. So even one of the most influential Protestant reformers did not see democracy as a biblical ideal. He saw it as a politically unstable. Calvin's practice matched that mindset. When Michael Servetus passed through Geneva preaching anti-Trinitarian views, Calvin denounced him. His associates brought the charges, and Calvin took an active role in the prosecution. The city council ultimately sentenced Servetus to death for heresy in 1553. Calvin supported the death penalty for persistent heresy, even though he asked that Servetus be executed by beheading rather than burning. In Calvin's world, there was no such thing as religious freedom. Spreading a false gospel was not a private disagreement. It was a crime against God and society. And that assumption was not unique to Geneva. One of the core tenets of modern democracy is religious freedom under a state that does not enforce theology. But before the modern era, Christian nations did enforce theology. In Britain, blasphemy laws made dissent a criminal matter even for people who still believed in a Christian God. Take the Blasphemy Act of 1697 in England. Its stated purpose was suppressing blasphemy and profaneness, and it explicitly targets anyone who denied the Trinity or rejected core Christian doctrines. A first offense stripped a person of the right to hold public office, and repeat offenses could bring sweeping civil disabilities and up to 3 years in prison. Rejecting the Trinity was not treated as an internal church debate. It was treated as a punishable threat to society. Scotland went even further. Blasphemy was written into statutes in 1661 with the death penalty for cursing or denying God or the Trinity, and the 1695 Act reaffirmed capital punishment for repeat offenders. Across the British Isles, non-Trinitarian Christians lived under laws that made their public faith illegal until Parliament finally wrote those specific penalties back in 1813. That should tell you how little tolerance there was for freedom of conscience under officially Christian government. You could believe in God, follow the moral teachings of Jesus, and still be criminalized simply for rejecting a particular interpretation of the Godhead. It took until the 19th century, long after the Enlightenment and the rise of secular political thought, for Parliament to step in and remove those religious restrictions. And that exposes a problem in the story Christians like Mike tell. A society can be thoroughly Christian for 1,000 years and still treat religious dissent as a threat to public order. Toleration did not appear because theologians suddenly found it in the Bible. It emerged because modern states were rebuilt on new assumptions about individual rights, pluralism, and limited government, ideas pushed by Enlightenment thinkers, political reformers, and minority groups who had to fight just to exist. So separation of church and state did not grow out of Christianity voluntarily, handing people freedom. It grew out of Christianity losing its legal monopoly. Once you see that, it becomes very hard to claim that Christianity invented religious liberty or modern democracy. What it often did instead was resist them until resistance became too costly to maintain. So when Mike Jones says Christianity was a determining factor in developing democracy, that is simply not true. The founding fathers of the United States established separation of church and state not primarily because they were devout Christians, but because they knew the dangers of religious coercion, both in Europe and in the colonies. Many of their forebears had fled Europe to escape religious control and to build a political model rooted in freedom of conscience. That concern is one reason they drafted the First Amendment, to prevent a national church. By now, it should be clear that through most of church history, democracy was usually criticized, not celebrated. And that should not surprise us, because democracy is not in the Bible. Mike tries to tell his audience that democracy is rooted there, but he can only do it through an inconsistent, ad hoc way of reading scripture. Let me show you what I mean. When Dan Barker challenged Mike about some of the horrific laws in the Old Testament, such as, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Mike's response was basically, "That's Old Testament. Christians don't follow that." Here's how he says it.
Just on that witch thing, one more thing. That's in the Old Testament. Christians are under the New Covenant. There's nothing about that.
Notice what just happened. Mike dismisses the Old Testament as having any binding force on Christian values. Christians follow the New Testament, not the Old Testament. So even if later Christians used the Old Testament to justify burning witches, in his framework, that would be a deviation from Christianity, not an expression of it. The Old Testament no longer applies. But then watch what he does when he wants to argue that democracy is a Christian value and that democracy originates from Christianity. Now he cites Deuteronomy.
I would agree with you that Christians, many Christians, like Isaac Newton, for example, many Christians were instrumental in rising above their Bible. But it's not Christianity that did it, it was Christians that did it. Christians did it in spite of Christianity, because all of these values that you talk about, all of these things that you think are great, and so do I, they don't come from the founding document of Christianity, the Bible.
You sure about that?
They're not there. Tell me, where is democracy in the Bible? Where is it?
It's okay, well, you can just read Joshua Berman's book, Created Equal. It's throughout Deuteronomy, for example. He points out that Deuteronomy envisions. Let me finish. Deuteronomy envisions an egalitarian society. It's not modern democracy, but there is those elements there where the people are called to, for example, decide if they want a king, to call up to do certain aspects in terms of like electing court of people, like judges, for example.
So which is it? Does the Old Testament inform Christian values or not? On the one hand, the Old Testament contains laws like executing witches, which clearly reflects a lack of religious freedom. And Mike says Christians are under the New Covenant, so it does not count. But on the other hand, when he thinks he can find a primitive hint of democracy in the Old Testament, suddenly it does count. Suddenly it is a Christian value and a precursor to modern democracy. Do you see the inconsistency? The Old Testament is irrelevant when it is morally embarrassing, but relevant when it supplies political talking points. That is not a principled way to read the Bible. That is a convenient way to read it. And this actually proves Dan Barker's point. The Bible contains all kinds of moral material, and Christians, like Mike Jones, have to wear an interpretive lens to sort out what still applies today and what does not. When a passage fits their moral instincts, they call it timeless. When it clashes with their instincts, they call it outdated. So the real question is not whether they can find pro-democracy material in the text. The real question is this: where did their pro-democracy moral instincts come from in the first place? That is something I hope Christians will seriously reflect on. Now, even if we grant that appealing to Deuteronomy is fair, it still does not follow that Deuteronomy teaches democracy. Joshua Berman is right that Deuteronomy envisions a kind of egalitarian society, but not in a modern sense. This is not a world of equal political rights for all people. women were still treated as subordinate to male authority, and biblical law allowed fathers to sell daughters into servitude. So whatever egalitarian means here, it is not democratic equality. What Deuteronomy actually stresses is that even the king must obey God's laws. In Deuteronomy 17:18-20, the king is commanded to copy the law, read it, and not exalt himself over his fellow Israelites. In other words, the king is not above the law. That is the idea of rule of law. But rule of law by itself is not democracy. In a democracy, laws ultimately come from the people through some form of popular sovereignty. In Deuteronomy, the laws come from God. The king is limited, yes, but he is limited by divine command, not by citizens governing themselves. The political picture here is much closer to theocracy than to democracy. And notice verse 15, the people are not empowered to choose whomever they want as king. They must appoint the king God chooses. The point is not people ruling themselves. The point is people submitting to God's authority. In that kind of system, there is no space for religious freedom or separation of church and state. The first commandment is not respect pluralism. It is no other gods before Yahweh. Given that foundation, it makes perfect sense that church leaders for most of history did not see religious liberty as a biblical ideal. And when Deuteronomy says the people may have a king if they want one, it reads less like an endorsement and more like a concession. The clearest proof is 1 Samuel 8. When the people demand a king, God responds that their desire is not neutral political preference. It is a rejection of God as their king. Does that sound like a positive comment on human self-rule? Of course not. Mike knows this too. When he brought up the book of Judges in the same debate, here is what he said.
Oh, from the book of Judges, the one where it ends by saying, in those days there was no king, so everyone did what they thought. So basically it's pointing out that they were acting on their own and doing what they thought was good, not following the law of God. That's the point of the book of Judges. The point of the book of Judges is that it got so bad that even the judges, like, for example, Samson and Jephthah, were doing all sorts of evil things. That's the point of Judges. You read the Judges, they get progressively worse until by the end there's no judge and everyone's running around doing whatever they want.
So in Mike's own framing, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It's not a celebration of freedom. It is a warning. People followed their own judgment instead of God's laws, and the result was moral and social collapse. Now think about what that means for his democracy claim. In the Old Testament, when people act on their own political and moral preferences apart from God's will, that is portrayed as a dissenter, not as a model to imitate. The point of Judges is not to look how healthy it is when people govern themselves. The point is, look what happens when they do. But democracy, by definition, is people choosing leaders they want and shaping a society around their shared judgments, including freedom of conscience and religion. That is exactly the kind of autonomy the Old Testament repeatedly discourages. What it advocates is theocracy, not democracy. So how does Mike turn this into the Old Testament gives us democracy? He has to flip the moral logic of the text on its head. That is not interpretation anymore. That is mental gymnastics. And it is not just the Old Testament. Mike does the same kind of eisegesis in the New Testament. He reads his modern political ideals into the text instead of letting the text speak for itself. He claims that not only democracy, but even separation of church and state comes straight out of the Bible. Here's how he puts it.
The separation of church and state, as I noted, comes out of the Christian tradition. It comes from Jesus saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God. It's developed by Augustine that is, and then it really comes to its fruition in the Protestant Reformation. Read the last article of the Augsburg Confession.
But what does Jesus is saying have to do with democracy or modern religious liberty? Nothing. The context is a trap about paying Roman taxes. Jesus is concerned by people who want him to either look like a rebel against Rome or a collaborator with Rome. He answers in a way that avoids the political charge while keeping his mission focused on God. That line has been interpreted in many ways, but in its original setting, it is about obligations under a pagan state, not about designing a pluralistic democracy. Jesus does not tell his disciples, if you ever gain political power, you must allow pagans to practice their religion, and you must never use the state to promote your own. At most, you can gather this principle. Even if you live under a hostile regime, you still do basic civic duties like paying taxes, and that does not automatically compromise your faith. Paying taxes to a dictator does not mean you are sinning. That is about all you can responsibly pull from that episode. It says nothing about voting rights, about leaders being chosen by the public, or about equal freedom for all religions. And notice the historical reality. If this passage clearly taught separation of church and state, why did the church not adopt anything like that for more than 1,000 years after Christianity became a state religion of the Roman Empire? When Christians gained power, they did not build a wall between church and state. They built confessional states. Christian emperors after Constantine persecuted pagans and heretics, and later European governments routinely enforced religious uniformity through heresy and blasphemy laws. That is the opposite of modern separation. All this modern projection of meaning into the text and the excuses for doing so shows something important. In practice, the Bible becomes a very flexible document in Christian hands. You can get it to say almost whatever you need it to say. And that raises a simple question. Where did you get the idea that you want the Bible to say in the first place? You obviously have to already value separation of church and state before you can read that into render unto Caesar. So where does that value come from? It does not come from the Christian faith itself. Maybe you think it comes from some other source besides secular humanism. That's fine, but at least acknowledge that this passage is not teaching separation of church and state. The idea is being brought to the text from outside. And here is what I find ironic. The Bible is extremely clear that worshiping other gods is a grave sin. Idolatry is treated as one of the most serious forms of rebellion against God. Yet modern Christians think it is God's will for the state to protect religious freedom, meaning people are free to worship idols in public. Christians should not worship idols, of course, but everyone else's right to do so should be protected. If God gives people free will, they should be able to exercise it. But notice how different the logic suddenly becomes when the topic is slavery. Many Christians argue that the Bible condemns slavery as sin, and they are adamant that this moral judgment should not just apply to Christians, but to everyone. People's free will to enslave others is not something the state should protect. It should be prohibited. So we get a strange contrast. The Bible's clearest moral prohibition, idolatry, is treated as a private community guidance that the state must not enforce. But a much less clear moral theme, slavery, is treated as a universal rule the state must enforce. What gets me is the lack of self-awareness. Christians will proudly say, of course we support religious freedom, without blinking at the fact that they are defending the public right to do what their own Bible calls the most serious kind of sin. Suddenly, those commands are only for believers, and the state must stay neutral. Fine, but when they turn around and insist that the Bible also condemns slavery in a way that everyone, Christian or not, must obey, even though the text is nowhere near as explicit on slavery as it is on idolatry. So the Bible becomes private guidance when enforcing it would clash with modern pluralism, but it becomes universal moral law when it lines up with modern ethics. And all of this gets packaged as, we are just following scripture. No, you are not. You are following contemporary values first, and then rereading scripture in whatever way lets you imagine you never changed your mind. What about the Augsburg Confession that Mike mentioned? The last article, Article 28, does say the office of the church and the office of the state should not be confused. But notice why. The confession explains that the church is responsible for spiritual work, preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments, while civil government is responsible for maintaining peace and carrying out justice. It also makes a key point that church leaders are not supposed to dictate any particular form of government. In other words, the church should not meddle with polity. That lines up with the New Testament itself. None of the New Testament authors lay out a political blueprint. Their focus is on the coming kingdom of God, not on designing earthly regimes. Still, this separation in Article 28 is only a division of labor. It does not say that states must be religiously neutral. It does not teach freedom of religion. If you look at what happened after the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, the Lutheran territories that emerged were confessional states. If your prince was Lutheran, you were expected to be Lutheran, or else leave. Catholic territories worked the same way in reverse, and both sides treated Anabaptists as enemies of public order, so they were persecuted by Protestants and Catholics alike. Freedom of conscience simply was not there. So if by separation of church and state, Mike means that the Augsburg Confession actually says a separation of roles, then sure, that is in the text. But by today's standards, that is a very thin version of separation. The larger truth is that neither the Bible nor most of the Christian tradition support the modern idea of a religiously neutral state with equal freedom for competing faiths. In fact, some conservative Christians today are quite aware of this discrepancy. This is why they do not support separation of church and state in the modern sense, and they push against the First Amendment whenever they can. We see this clearly in contemporary politics. On September 8, 2025, Donald Trump announced that the Department of Education would issue new guidance giving what he called total protection for prayer in public schools, and he got loud applause for it.
I'm pleased to announce this morning that the Department of Education will soon issue new guidance protecting the right to prayer in our public schools, and it's total protection.
That is a direct attempt to blur the lines between public education and public religion. And the people cheering are not secular humanists. They are the very Christians who want the state to privilege their faith. It is precisely because of this constant pressure against the First Amendment that groups like the Freedom from Religion Foundation exist. FFRF's own purpose statement says its mission is to promote the constitutional principle of separation of state and church and to educate the public on matters relating to non-theism. In other words, they exist to keep governments accountable when religious movements try to erode constitutional neutrality. Dan Barker happens to be FFRF's co-president. So in this debate, Barker is literally defending the constitutional principle that Mike claims to support. But do you know what surprised me? I was honestly shocked to see how little regard Mike Jones has for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. In his debate review, he mocks Dan Barker by impersonating him and saying this.
Listen, Mike, you might like reading, but audience dumb. Audience doesn't like to read. Audience angry. Audience more like me. We don't read, okay? We're not going to read all this stuff. We have frivolous lawsuits to file at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
When I heard that, I thought, wait, what? Why mock an organization whose stated purpose is to uphold the separation of church and state, the very thing you keep calling a Christian value? I genuinely don't know what to make of that. If you have an explanation, drop it in the comments. My guess is that Mike likes the slogan, separation of church and state, as long as it is defended by Christians. But when secular groups enforce it against Christian privilege, suddenly it becomes frivolous lawsuit. Now, Mike doesn't just appeal to the Bible in a debate. He also tries to argue that sociological research supports his view that Christian religiosity reduces support for Christian nationalism. Let's hear him.
With the recent rise of Christian nationalism, many people are worried about the effects Christianity may have. But you might be surprised to find out that Christian nationalism seems to be more motivating among the least churched individuals on the right. A study from 2021 found that among politically right individuals, Christian nationalism was found among those who are the least religious. They say, we find no evidence that Christian nationalism mobilized church-based support in the election. And they say white nationalist groups in the United States explicitly use Christian nationalist rhetoric. But those who identify with such movements tend to not be strongly involved in mainstream Christian congregations.
Not surprisingly, Mike is misreading the research again. I spent a lot of time on this in part 1 and 2. This time, the problem is not just confusing correlation with causation. He is claiming things that the paper does not even measure. The 2021 study he is leaning on is about Trump voting, not about who is more likely to be a Christian nationalist in general. The authors found that Christian nationalism predicts Trump support only among non-churchgoers. Among regular attenders, the effect is weak and not statistically different from zero. That is what no evidence that Christian nationalism mobilized church-based support in the election means. It is a statement about a voting model, not about the origins or prevalence of Christian nationalism. What the paper does is straightforward. It compares Trump voting across different levels of Christian nationalism, and it checks whether church attendance changes that relationship. The key finding is this. Among people who already score high on Christian nationalism, non-attenders are more likely to vote for Trump than regular attenders. The study is about how Christian nationalism and attendance interact in predicting Trump voting. It is not a test of whether church-going prevents people from becoming Christian nationalists. So using it to imply more church will cure Christian nationalism is simply not what the authors were doing. Even if Mike's real concern is only voting for Trump, the pattern still does not give him a clean talking point. At low levels of Christian nationalism, people are already unlikely to vote for Trump, and in that range, church attendance nudges Trump support up compared to non-attendance. At high levels of Christian nationalism, attendance nudges Trump support down compared to non-attendance. So there is no honest way to summarize this as more church means less Trump. It depends on where someone sits on Christian nationalism. Look at the relevant chart in this paper. After controlling for confounders, the line for regular attenders is almost flat. People who attend church can have low, medium, or high Christian nationalism, but their predicted probability of voting for Trump stays at roughly the same level. In that group, Christian nationalism adds little extra push toward Trump. For non-attenders, the line slopes sharply upwards. At the low Christian nationalism, they are less likely to vote for Trump than attenders. As Christian nationalism raises, their Trump support raises faster, and at high levels, they actually surpass attenders. That is the whole interaction line authors are describing. So if someone treated these correlations as simple causes, the takeaway would still be mixed. Attendance is linked to more Trump voting among people low in Christian nationalism and to less Trump voting among people high in Christian nationalism. The paper does not support a simple slogan, but the real issue in this debate is not just Trump voting. It is Christian nationalism itself and its threat to church-state separation. On that front, Mike's move is still indefensible. Ask a basic question. Who is more likely to oppose a strict separation of church and state and push for school prayer or Christian America policies? Secular humanists or people who identify as Christians? You do not need this paper to see the answer. When you watch efforts to blur or erode the First Amendment, the actors are overwhelmingly Christian, not secular. So appealing to this study as proof that promoting Christianity solves Christian nationalism goes far beyond what the data actually show. Mike brings up another study. This time it covers Europe.
And similar results were found in Europe. One study found that although populist radical right parties tend to advertise themselves as defending Christian identity and values, they don't attract many Christian voters. They say these parties take pains to show that they are defenders of Christian identity and values, and yet they do not widely attract religious Christian voters. Our analyses confirm that paradox. As religiosity increases, the odds of voting for a PRR party instead of a mainstream right party decline.
Without explanation, this quote can be misleading. The authors are not saying that non-religious people are more likely to vote for populist radical right parties. The pool this study focuses on is entirely Christian. Here is a quote. We eliminated all respondents who identified as non-Christian. So when they talk about PRR voters being relatively non-religious, they are not talking about secular humanists. They are talking about nominal or weakly religious Christians within a Christian sample. What does their results actually mean then? It means that within a Christian population on the right, the very devout Christians tend to stick with mainstream Christian or conservative parties, while the less religious Christians are more open to switching to a populist radical right party. In other words, higher religiosity keeps some Christians anchored to the respectable right instead of drifting to the more extreme right option. It does not mean atheists or secular humanists are flocking to the far right. And notice something else. These PRR parties are not wrapping themselves in secular humanist symbols. They loudly present themselves as defenders of Christian identity and Christian values. That strategy only works because many voters still see themselves as culturally Christian, even if their church involvement is thin. The raw material for this kind of politics is Christian identity, not secularism. So Mike's spin is doing a quiet bait and switch. The study shows that more religious Christians prefer mainstream right parties over PRR parties. It does not show that secularism produces the radical right, or that promoting Christianity in general is the cure. If anything, it shows that the real dividing line is inside Christianity itself, between devout Christians who stay with the mainstream parties and nominal Christians whose Christian identity can be mobilized by the far right. So promoting Christian belief in general is not a strategy that will shrink the far right. At best, it leaves the problem untouched. In practice, it expands the overall Christian population, which also enlarges the pool of nominal and cultural Christians that PRR parties can mobilize. If you follow that logic through, Mike's proposal risks increasing, not decreasing the number of people available to support the far right. Let's keep going.
In fact, Christian religiosity tends to aid in making one less likely to vote for a far-right radical party. One may ask how this could be the case, but the logic isn't complicated. It's simple. When individuals on the right leave traditional Christian religiosity, they keep a lot of the symbols and cultural heritage, and then reinterpret them in political ways, thereby creating political religions that have repurposed Christian symbols. Philip Gorski says, loose from its religious moorings, religious nationalism floats free of the ethical tether of Christian ethics and drifts even further in the direction of secular messianism and political authoritarianism.
Again, Mike's description proves the opposite of what he wants it to prove. Listen to what he and Gorski are actually describing. They are talking about people who leave traditional Christian religiosity but keep Christian symbols and identity, and then turn that identity into religious nationalism. That is not the same thing as becoming secular humanists or non-religious in any meaningful sense. These are still culturally Christian voters. They still see the nation as Christian. They still want crosses, flags, in God we trust, and leaders who talk about God blessing America. They are just no longer closely tied to churches. So when they build this so-called political religion, they are not borrowing from Buddhism, atheism, or secular humanism. They are repurposing Christian heritage. That means two things. First, you cannot use this to blame secularism or non-religion for far-right politics. The people in question are not secular humanists trying to erase religion. They are people whose Christian identity has gone political. Second, if the raw material for this political religion is Christian heritage and Christian symbols, then expanding Christianity in a population gives you more raw material to work with, not less. So yes, Church-going may sometimes divert right-wing voters away from the most radical parties and toward more respectable conservative options, but that does not magically turn Christianity into the solution to Christian nationalism. The core issue is still a nationalist politics that wraps itself in Christian symbols, and you cannot seriously pretend that secular humanists are the ones driving that. Now, in this last segment of the series, I want to share my own take on the debate topic. If you have been following along, you probably know why I am not a fan of framing this as a clear binary, as if we can reach a simple verdict that either secular humanism is better for society or Christianity is better. The first problem is that Christianity is not one fixed thing. It's a broad and flexible set of beliefs. There are thousands of denominations today, each defining Christianity a little differently. And if we look across history, the differences widen even more. On top of that, where you land in this debate depends on what you count as a good society and how much weight you give each factor. People value different outcomes and rank them differently. So the answer is not going to be a neat math problem. I can tell you which aspects of secular humanism I think are good for society, but I cannot honestly claim that a society made up of any form of secular humanism would be objectively better than every version of Christianity that has ever existed in every way. That is not what this series of videos is trying to prove. My purpose here is narrower. I am pushing back on Mike's argument and on the way he uses research to suggest Christianity is superior to secular humanism in producing a healthier society. Still, if you force me to take a general stand, I side with secular humanism, at least provisionally. The main reason is simple. Secular humanism, by definition, aims at human flourishing. So if a secular humanist society adopts a policy that ends up harming people or destabilizing society, it wouldn't be because harm was the goal. It would be because they misjudged the consequences. They thought a policy would help people flourish, and it didn't. That kind of mistake is real, but it is also correctable. You can learn, reevaluate, and change course. Christianity works from a different center. It does not treat human flourishing as the highest priority. This is not controversial. The highest priority is obedience to God and the glorification of God. Christianity is God-centered, not human-centered. So actions are judged first by whether they align with God's will, not by whether they maximize well-being. When a command seems to reduce well-being, many Christians do not see that as evidence the command is wrong. They see it as the cost of faithfulness. Here is a concrete example. Many conservative Christians know that treating non-traditional sexual orientation as sinful is linked to higher rates of depression and distress among LGBTQ people. But they will often say that this is the cross LGBTQ Christians must bear. In that framework, suffering is not a reason to revise the moral rule. It is a sign of loyalty. Now, some progressive Christians reinterpret the Bible and conclude that God affirms same-sex relationships. That shift does tend to increase well-being for LGBTQ people within those communities. But notice what is driving the change. It is not, this harms people, therefore it must be wrong. It is, we have found a way to read the text differently, therefore God's will is different. You rarely find a Christian who remains convinced that homosexuality is a sin and then says, even so, I reject that rule because it harms people, and human flourishing takes priority. The moral authority is still external, and I worry about what that does to moral judgment. For many believers, the fear of hell and the hope of heaven are always in the background. Those pressures can distort moral thinking. They can push people to obey, not because they are persuaded something is right, but because they feel they have no real choice. They may silence their own conscience to protect their salvation. In my view, a moral system that leans that hard on ultimatum and fear is fragile, and it can block the kind of honest moral reasoning a good society needs. That's why Christian apologists end up defending mass killings in the Old Testament. They feel forced to do it because they cannot allow themselves to say God was unjust. So they shift the blame onto the victims. The Canaanites deserved annihilation, they say, because of child sacrifice. They treated their children as expendable. Therefore, killing all their children is justice. And they say it with a straight face.
The difficult case here is the children. And what I would say is, first, that God has the right to take anyone's life whenever he wants to. Unfortunately, children die all the time in infancy. And so if God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, prematurely, that's his prerogative.
I don't see how living inside a worldview that makes your moral judgment this rigid can be good for society in the long run. I just don't see it. I can't think of any honest reason why embracing that worldview would produce a better society than one that puts human flourishing first. So that's why, if I have to choose, I choose secular humanism. Not because secular humanists are always right, but because the framework is oriented toward human flourishing and can revise itself when it gets things wrong. Christianity can revise too, but only as long as believers can reinterpret God's will to allow the revision. That difference matters. I know Mike will say I shouldn't focus on what the worldview teaches, but on the outcomes. But that is exactly the problem. Mike never gives us a mechanism. Why would believing in a pro-slavery Bible make someone anti-slavery? Why would believing in a jealous, exclusivist God make someone celebrate religious freedom? On its face, that makes no sense. And without a mechanism, you can't just declare that the positive outcomes originate from Christianity. It is far more likely that they come from somewhere else. In fact, encouraging people to revere the Bible as the Word of God increases the chance that some will notice what it actually teaches, including that slavery is not inherently sinful. Here is a comment I received under Part 3. Slavery under a righteous God-serving master is beneficial for both parties, and if you are being mistreated, then you are all the more blessed in heaven. Christians, are you surprised that a fellow Christian would say something like that? You shouldn't be, because this is the direction the Bible pushes in both the Old and New Testament. What is more surprising is not that some Christians think like this, but that more don't. And the Bible is also part of why Christian nationalism keeps resurfacing. Look at Doug Wilson. He is a Bible literalist. As far as I can tell, he takes the text seriously and follows it where it leads. And he concludes correctly that the Bible does not teach democracy. It teaches theocracy. That is why he is a Christian nationalist and why he has attracted a sizable Christian following. Here is a segment from an interview.
Is planting a church in D.C. part of your mission to try to turn this into a Christian nation?
Yes. So every society is theocratic. The only question is who's theo? In a secular democracy, it would be demos, the people. In a Christian republic, it'd be Christ.
And pay attention to what he and other Christian nationalists say about the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote.
There are some who have gone so far as to say that they want the 19th Amendment repealed.
I would support that. And I'd support it on the basis that the atomization that comes with our current system is not good for humans.
The reason I include these clips is simple. I want you to see that Christianity as a system is unstable. There is not much Christians can say to stop another Christian from taking the Bible literally, even when that literal reading harms people, as long as the person can say, I'm just obeying what God wants. That is what worries me. Secular humanism, on the other hand, is not dogmatic in the same way. It does not come with the sacred scripture that everyone is obliged to profess. It is meant to be self-correcting. Some Christians point out that early Enlightenment thinkers were racist and even used the science of their time to justify discrimination. Let's grant that some of them were precursors to modern secular humanists. I have no problem saying they were wrong. We learned from those failures, and we do not need to repeat them. Can I prove that secular humanism produces a better society? No, I can't. This is my judgment, not a mathematical proof. You can take it or leave it. I am not attached to it as a creed. In fact, I hope that 100 years from now, humanity will have built something better than what we call secular humanism today. Maybe there will be a secular humanism 2.0 or 3.0. If that happens, I will welcome it. What matters to me is progress toward human flourishing, not loyalty to a label. This series has been a long journey. If you watched all 4 videos, please leave a comment below so I can personally thank you for your support. That would mean a lot to me. And if you feel like it, tell me which issue I covered you found most interesting or helpful. I look forward to reading what you think. That's all I have to say. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.